Well, here we are, balmy late autumn. The birds are singing, getting ready to roost. Now we're going to discuss trickle down economics number 47. Looks like the Labor Party has a significant majority in the House of Representatives, and the Greens determine what legislation goes through the Senate or not, to a significant degree, what progressive legislation, that we have the ability to move away from trickle down economics. Trickle down economics is what we've had in the last 40 to 50 years during the deregulation, privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation tsunami which has swept over not just Australia but the rest of the world. The philosophy is very simple. Increase productivity, share increasing profits of the population. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. We see this over and over again with the creation of billionaires, multimillionaires, and the problems associated with such an economic system, in terms that the majority of people do not reap those benefits. And that's why I call it trickle down economics. Not trickle down economics, but trickle down economics. Now, we've had a massive variety of trickle down economic theories in the last 50 years, and looks like Mr. Albanese, the current Prime Minister, is going to embark on another trickle down economics model. Let's call it model number 46 for the sake of debate. What he wants to do is strengthen the private sector in order to strengthen the economy. I'll repeat that again. Strengthen the private sector in order to strengthen the economy. Nothing could be further from the truth. In a capitalist society, one based on a private investment for private profit ideology, you need competition. If there's no competition in the economy, we see what we see today. It's very simple. Today, when you look at the so-called housing crisis, which the Prime Minister and the Labor Party and their, His Majesty's loyal opposition promote, what they're promoting is the expansion of the private sector in the housing market, providing taxpayer money to the private sector to try to resolve the issue. Now, in any field of economy, in a private investment for private profit market that is almost totally deregulated, all that happens is you create duopolies and monopolies. You create an economic system where the major corporations are too big to fail. If they fail, there are major consequences for everybody in the community. So going down this model, talking about increasing productivity, strengthening the economy through private investment and through taxpayer-funded donations, welfare to the corporate sector, that somehow we are going to resolve the issues that plague us today, is total, unadulterated lunacy. Why try the same thing for the 46th time, or the 60th time, or the 120th time, when experience teaches you that you cannot achieve the results you want to achieve in terms of sharing the commonwealth amongst the population at large by pursuing this particular ideological mantra. Now, the Labor Party finds itself in an extraordinary situation as far as its House of Representatives majority is concerned, and it finds itself in an extraordinary situation as far as progressive forces in the Senate are concerned, where the combination of the Labor senators' vote and the Green senators' vote could pass any legislation within the constitutional framework of this country. But what do we have? We are going backwards. We are looking at the past. We are going to try the same thing over and over again that has failed in the past, and in 3 years' time we'll be asked to make another decision. There is not a more opportune moment to explore different aspects of the economy. Now is the time to take that challenge, not just in terms of radical reform, as I spoke last week, of the taxation system, but taking the bull by the horns and recreating and creating 2 new models in the economic mix in order to create competition and improve access to the population as a whole. And the things I'm talking about are things that have been tried in the past. Things that any government, through a reformist program, can introduce. The first one is either nationalising essential services like energy production instead of giving taxpayers money to centralised energy producing corporations, or creating new state-owned enterprises. But this time, the ownership of those enterprises should not be incorporated in the hands of the government, which, when it finds itself in financial difficulties, will sell off these public assets. But the ownership should be incorporated in the Australian Constitution. I'm quite confident that if this question was put to the Australian people in a future referendum, whether they wanted public assets incorporated in the Australian Constitution, so they and they alone had the power to decide whether to privatise these assets or not, that such a referendum would pass all hurdles, jump over any hurdles put in its path. So this is the first thing we should think of. We should put finances, taxpayers' finances, not in the private sector, but in a new public sector. A public sector which provides essential services and goods to the population at large at a reasonable price. A public sector which is a public sector in housing, in education, in infrastructure, in health, and the list goes on and on. With taxation reforms, there is nothing stopping governments from actually using the extra revenue which is obtained from the corporate sector to be funneled into public assets which belong to the people of this country through their inclusion in the Australian Constitution. This is one way of expanding the economy in order to strengthen it through competition between the public and private sector. Nothing highlights this more than the housing sector. The current crisis is totally due to governments relying on the private sector to provide homes. It is due to the privatisation of public housing across the country by various state governments. It's due to the fact that federal governments have not been willing to invest in the public housing sector. And even when they provide money to the state entities, these state entities use those resources for other things. So the creation of a strong public sector introduces competition in a private investment for private profit society. If there is no competition, prices escalate. Irrespective of what inquiries are held by governments, what royal commissions are set up, what institutions are legislated to keep an eye on monopolies and duopolies and triopolies, the fact is that if you do not have a strong public sector, there is no possibility that the economy will strengthen. It may strengthen, but in terms of profitability, that profitability will be stuck in the hands of the corporate sector, in the hands of major shareholders, in the hands of the bureaucracy, in those particular corporate entities. And that's the dilemma that faces the federal government. Instead of pussyfooting around and talking about strengthening the economy through public investment in the private sector, the government should be talking about establishing significant public entities to provide essential goods and services to the community at large. If we don't do this, nothing will change, irrespective of the gloss that is put on any legislation which goes through Parliament. So we are at a critical juncture. We can continue trickle-down economics, or we can introduce competition by expanding the public sector. Another thing that Australia is not very good at is the development of cooperatives and collectives. Nobody becomes rich in their involvement in a cooperative and collectives. Cooperatives and collectives are established in order to provide employment opportunities and the productions of goods and services to localities as well as people as a whole. Australia does have a history of mutual aid and cooperatives and collectives in the 19th century, and it had a history of mutual organisation. Like the Australian Mutual Provident Fund, AMP, was just that, a mutual fund which was set up by workers in the 1880s and 1890s in order to provide security for those people who invested in those mutual societies. In the 1980s, we saw an orgy of demutualisation. Even the New South Wales New South Wales CV was privatised. We saw multiple mutual societies being demutualised and taken over by corporations. About the only mutual society which continues today as a large entity is the Royal Australian Club of Victoria, RACV, which didn't demutualise, unlike its partner in New South Wales. So the main issue affecting the growth of the cooperative and collective sector in this country is seeding funding. No financial institution will lend to set up a cooperative or collective in this country. Those few that exist need to find alternative forms of finance, which is very difficult to obtain. So in order to create a vibrant cooperative and collective sector, which then can compete with the public sector and the private sector in the Australian economy, it requires seeding funding. At the beginning of the 20th century, banks did not lend to small business. One of the first legislative requirements of one of the very few first Labor governments in the world was the creation of the Commonwealth Bank, a people's bank, so it would be able to lend to small businesses and individuals. And the Commonwealth Bank became the largest bank in this country. It was publicly owned until the 1980s, when the successive Labor governments privatised it for peppercorn money. Today, Commonwealth Bank shares are almost $100 a share in comparison to what they were sold for in the 1980s. I think it was $3 a share, or around $3 a share. So the issue is the need for seeding funding. So you can either do this by the creation of a new Commonwealth Bank, which in its constitutional structure has to lend seeding funding to cooperatives and collectives, or instead of investing superannuation contributions, the trillions of dollars in superannuation contributions in the stock market, in stocks and shares, if 1% of superannuation contributions were set aside, were quarantined to provide seeding funding for cooperatives and collectives, you would see a huge increase in cooperatives and collectives. Cooperatives and collectives provide people the ability to self-manage their lives, organise their own work in the way they want to organise it, share profits that are made, and provide goods and services to local communities. So instead of putting all our resources into the private sector, hoping against hope that the growth of the private sector will somehow lead to the improvement of lives of millions of people in this country, we should be looking at the extension of the economic model to include a vibrant, strong public sector whose ownership is incorporated in the Australian Constitution, and a cooperative and collective sector that is provided seeding funding through the creation of a new Commonwealth Bank, with a quarantining of 1% of superannuation contributions to be used to start up cooperatives and collectives. Some will fail, many will be profitable. Those that are profitable will be able to return that loan with interest to those superannuation funds. Think about it. Do you really want the 46th, the 76th, the 96th, the 106th model of trickle-down economics, courtesy of a Labor government which has not shown any signs that it is willing to introduce reforms to expand the economy so that everybody, not just a shrinking minority, not just the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, profit and prosper from those changes.